This podcast may contain explicit language. Welcome to the Greatest Movie of All Time podcast, the show that uses a unique grading style to redefine what the greatest movies are. I'm Tom Duncan.
And I'm Dana Duncan.
And you're obviously, loose as a goose if you're doing the Batuzzi during the opening musical cue. I know people at home on YouTube can't see that, thank God, but my goodness, are you, what's gotten into you already?
I don't know.
Is it because you've been on the road all day?
It's been a long day, but yes, that's fine. I get very punchy when I'm tired.
Yeah, clearly. This is going to go really well on Pulp Fiction of no less. Oh, I feel sorry for our guest, but we also welcome back our celebrity guest. He is the managing editor and senior film critic at MovieArcher.com. You know him from his previous appearance on Batman 1989. Please welcome back Adam Freed.
Tom, Dana, what a pleasure to be back with you guys. Had so much fun on the Batman episode. And just when I think it couldn't get any better, here we are with one of my all-time favorites. So I really appreciate you having me back on.
Say what again?
Say what again?
So, tonight, for our 227th episode, we revisit the 1994 classic Pulp Fiction, written and directed by Quentin Tarantino, starring John Travolta as Vincent Vega, Samuel L. Jackson as Jules Winnfield, Uma Thurman as Mia Wallace, Harvey Keitel as Winston Wolfe, Tim Roth as Ringo/Pumpkin, Amanda Plummer as Yolanda/Honey Bunny, Maria de Medeiros as Fabienne, Ving Rhames as Marsellus Wallace, Eric Stoltz as Lance, Rosanna Arquette as Jody, or the lady with all the shit in her face, Christopher Walken as Captain Coons, and Bruce Willis as Butch Coolidge. Recognition for this film, Pulp Fiction was released on October 14th, 1994. After receiving the Palme d'Or at Cannes earlier that year, buzz built for the film critically until its full release. It would go on to win the box office in its opening week and, on a budget of $8.5 million, gross $213.9 million worldwide in 1994, finishing as the 10th highest grossing film of the year and Miramax's biggest film to date. The film would make a household name out of Quentin Tarantino and Samuel L. Jackson and reinvigorated the career of John Travolta. Pulp Fiction would receive 7 Oscar nominations for Best Picture, Director for Tarantino, Actor for Travolta, Supporting Actor for Jackson, Supporting Actress for Uma Thurman, Film Editing, and it won for Original Screenplay for both Tarantino and Roger Avary. Pulp Fiction soon became a watershed moment for not only the industry, but also the culture at large. The film has been celebrated since its original release by fans and critics alike, with many of them naming it among the greatest films of all time. The AFI recognized Pulp Fiction on the following lists: AFI's 100 Years, 100 Movies at number 95, AFI's 100 Years, 100 Laughs, it was a nominated film, AFI's 100 Years, 100 Thrills at number 53, it was on AFI's 100 Years, 100 Heroes and Villains with Vincent Vega and Jules Winnfield as nominated villains. It was on AFI's 100 Years, 100 Movie Quotes with 2 nominations, Bring Out the Gimp, and They Call It a Royale with Cheese. AFI's 100 Years, 100 Movies 10th Anniversary Edition at number 94, and it was in AFI's 10 Top 10 as the number 7 gangster film of all time. In 2013, Pulp Fiction was selected for preservation in the United States National Film Registry. Pulp Fiction would also be voted number 129 on the Sight and Sound Greatest Movies of All Time list in 2022. Pulp Fiction currently holds a 92% among critics on Rotten Tomatoes, a 95 score on Metacritic, and a 4.3 out of 5 on Letterboxd. So, as we begin each week, Dad, what is your relationship to this film?
It was a film your mother and I rented probably a year or so after it came out, because we kept hearing about it. Of course, your mother has a strong aversion to anything Tarantino now, having now watched this film. I, at the time, was a criminal defense attorney and was a lot less tolerant of, I didn't care for a lot of crime dramas. And so this did not strike a chord with me. And then your mother just going on and on about how bad it was kind of ruined it for me.
Yes, that's right. Just put all the blame on her.
Didn't care for the film all that much, but I didn't think it was nearly as bad as what she said. Needless to say, I've only seen it, I think, one other time until I watched it again for this episode. And having looked at it as a more mature man and having watched a lot more film, I have a new appreciation for it.
I would say I think I've only seen it about 3, maybe 4 times total. I think I saw it once in college. I have liked other Tarantino films a lot more. I know that this is the one that most people point to, but obviously I have an affinity for Inglourious Basterds. I love Reservoir Dogs. And if you listen to our Once Upon a Time in Hollywood episode, you know that that's like my personal favorite of his movies. This one, to me, always felt a little bit, I don't know if I want to call shots fired already, but overrated comparatively. I know.
Guys, I'm about to fall out of my chair. Dana's coming in hot from the get-go. Tom just used the word overrated. As you were just reading the multitude of information about the film, I wrote down in my notes, it only has a 92% on Rotten Tomatoes. I want to meet those 8%. Who are those people? I'm flustered. I am flabbergasted listening to you say that this movie might be overrated. I guess I'll be the one to stand for my boy Tarantino here, but sorry to jump in. Wow, what a start.
So, first off, I think the first Tarantino film I watched was Inglourious Basterds, and I didn't get it, at first. I was kind of annoyed by the whole Hitler dying in a fire type of thing and the revisionist history of it the first time. But that being said, I thought that it was funny, I thought it was fresh and whatever else. And I do think that depending on which film you are introduced to his first, it kind of takes on a certain life of its own because he is a different voice in filmmaking. So for most people who probably didn't see Reservoir Dogs when it originally came out and only came out, I guess, in mass about the time that Pulp Fiction became a bigger film, kind of, I would compare it to the Da Vinci Code. Angels and Demons was not well read until the Da Vinci Code became an overnight success. All of a sudden, Dan Brown's got 2 books simultaneously in the bestseller list because everybody's like, oh, there's another book? So you go back and watch that one. Much like that, Reservoir Dogs got a following after the fact because of the success of Pulp Fiction.
I think that's
his
fair.
Celebrity status thereof. But because of that, when you are introduced to one of these films, I think that one takes on a personal significance in a way that some of the other ones maybe don't, because the shtick maybe wears a little bit. And I do think there are parts of this that I would critique comparative to other ones where I think he's a much crisper, better executed filmmaker.
I think the thing that Tarantino did so well to support this film is he was great in front of the camera. Now, there's been amazing directors that you put them on a talk show and they just didn't have a ton to say. But I think Tarantino, to this day, is one of the greatest storytellers. He has this unbelievable wealth of film knowledge that he's willing to share with the world. He's very open about his influences, maybe not as open about some of his shortcomings, but he's someone who sold the heck out of this movie and fell in love with him. I was 13 years old when this movie came out. And I was that kid who subscribed to Entertainment Weekly magazine. And the fall preview hit, and sure enough, there's Pulp Fiction on the cover. And from that moment, it might have been a September magazine release, and I knew it was going to be released around me in Illinois in October. And I said, somehow, some way, I need to find a way in to see this movie. And so I bought a ticket to the John Candy, rest in peace, Richard Lewis, rest in peace. I'll just air quote that it was a comedy. It was called Wagons East. Do you guys remember this movie?
Yes, it was John Candy's last film.
Correct. Yeah. I didn't go to it because I bought a ticket for Wagons East and I walked into Pulp Fiction with my friend Nick. We were in junior high. And let me tell you something. A 13-year-old should not see this movie not knowing anything about Quentin Tarantino, but I did. I
just
can't
like a
tell
9-year-old
you,
shouldn't see Rosemary's Baby.
Yeah.
This seems to be a reoccurring theme, all the things we saw too early. This was a major formative awakening for me. Much like you, Tom, I can't say I fully got it at 13. The nonlinear timeline, it definitely threw me for a loop. But I had never seen a movie that looked like this. I had never heard dialogue delivered that sounded like this. I walked out and I said, do people really talk that way? Is that the way that adults interact in the world? And if so, where do I sign up? How do I become one of those? And so I'm not sure I knew exactly what I saw at 13, but I knew it washed over me in a way that I had discovered this new toy and I just couldn't wait to somehow see it again.
And I think that's most people's relationship with it. For whatever reason, it's just never completely clicked in. Like, I find the movie to be fascinating as a medium of pop culture and how often it's referenced or cited or any number of things. And I agree with you. Quentin is a fantastic podcast guest. He can quote chapter and verse on most things and just pull it out of thin air, all the film references, because he's used these forever for all of his films. I mean, this one has a long reference list of things that he pulled or executed from other film directors to use in this movie, specifically. So, but for whatever reason, I don't know. It's never quite taken on the same legendary status that it has for certain people that grew up in the 90s. And I think maybe it's that I'm a little bit too young for that, or I was introduced to some of his other movies before that, because like I have that affinity for several of Quentin's movies, just not this one, for whatever reason.
I know the first time I saw this, it was probably the lowest budget film I had ever seen in a theater, if that makes sense. They don't market $8.5 million movies to 13-year-olds. They don't do that, right? So just the year before, I had seen Jurassic Park, and that was the greatest thing I had ever seen. We call back to the Batman episode we did together in 1989. That was the greatest thing I'd ever seen. These were massive productions. Somehow Miramax scraped together this director, and I'm sure we're going to talk about the cast and how that kind of came to be. This was a $220 million movie that they made for less than $9 million. And I'm not sure all of that really soaked into me at 13, but I knew it was special. And I knew I had uncovered something. It was like, wait, there's more than just dinosaurs chasing Jeeps. And that felt like the beginning of me being a lover of film, seeing this movie, even though I didn't fully understand it.
I think for you, you have a closeness to this film in the same way that I do The Departed. It's that first like adult, oh, this is different. This is what crime dramas are. This is what violence in film actually is. This is what good acting can look like when it's not being mouthed by Shrek.
Yeah, fair.
So, yeah, when you have those seminal, like, this is my adult movie life now, I think that does take on a certain life to it itself. But, and here's the challenge, what is this movie actually about?
Yeah, so I've probably watched this movie, I'm going to guess 25 to 30 times at this point, a couple more times to prepare for this pod. My best estimate is that if you had to zoom out of the plot and really take a look at the film in its entirety, I read this as a film about redemption. And when you look at the various people whose story is being portrayed in this, most of them are who society would call bad, right? You've got a pair of hitmen working for a dangerous drug dealer. You've got a narcotics-infused wife who has a questionable relationship with these different men who work for her husband. You've got the shady boxer, right? All of these people we look at and we say, wow, there's something wrong with them. But that's not true in the eyes of Tarantino, because there are those characters who seek redemption, many of whom find it, and there are those who are not interested in redemption, and most of them will meet a fate that we get to witness within the film. And so if we pan way out of the cross-cutting and the nonlinear, this is a movie about doing right by one another. It's a story about redemption.
So I know that much like other podcasts in this space, particularly ones that are analyzing older films as opposed to current ones, all of us owe, in some regard, a debt of gratitude to the Rewatchables from The Ringer. And they recently just did Pulp Fiction on their episode. And I thought their conclusion as to the point of the film, that of similarly a redemption, but it's never too late to make the right choice, rings somewhat true. That a lot of the characters in this find a way to make the right choice for them. And the right choice has kind of an amorphous meaning within this film. For Butch, it was, I'm going to take a samurai sword and cut down one guy and then let Marsellus basically torture the other guy. But I get to walk away scot-free. For Jules, it's, I'm going to let these guys take my money and then I'm going to walk away from this life of crime. So it takes on multiple meanings, but I think the fact that that speech by Jules at the end ends the film, even though it technically comes in the middle of the actual story arc, is fitting for what this movie is supposed to be about. And redemption could be one way of putting it, but I'll say it's never too late to make the right choice.
For me, this whole thing had a lot different meaning than the last time I saw it, because I was having trouble signing in I was on vacation, so I was having trouble signing in on Amazon to watch it. I signed in on my tablet, and for whatever reason, all the notes, director's notes, came up next to it. And so I'm following the director's notes as far as which scenes matched which and how it all worked and what the relationship was. And it had a whole new meaning for me. And I agree with the whole redemption aspect of this that you've both touched on, because I think that's ultimately what it is. And it's all about decisions, and decisions that are made and decisions that are followed. You know, whether it be Butch deciding to just leave or going back and saving. But just the fact that so many of the scenes were tied to something else. The scene where he gives him the choice of picking up the gun or not is a direct scene that Tarantino lifted from Rio Bravo. That type of stuff just had a lot more meaning to me. And so I think the meaning of the film was much clearer this watch than it had been the first time I watched it, to say the least.
And do you think, Dana, that led you to enjoy it more this time around?
Yes. I think part of the problem was, it was the nonlinear fashion when I first saw it was so unique and different. I had a very difficult time, having grown up watching film, and films started with the beginning and ended with the end.
Sure they did.
To see it jump around like that made it disconcerting and difficult for me to follow. I know that when I first watched Inglourious Bastards, I had a problem with it because, again, I'm a historian. So changing the history just kind of, it wasn't until I actually thought about it a few days afterwards and I go, oh, okay, all right. It's not really him trying to change the history. It's kind of giving a alternative view of what could have happened, and I'm much less of a critic of it as a result. And I think if I would have stopped and really thought about it, it wasn't that I disliked it. It was just difficult for me at that point in my life to follow along and really to root for any of the characters in this movie. It's kind of like an entire group of people that I knew on a daily basis, and I didn't have any admiration or empathy for.
You know, we talk a lot about the non-linear fashion of this film. If you really think about it, and you treat the Christopher Walken scene as just a flashback, which therefore it could be in order because you're just looking into Butch's dream that he immediately wakes up from, and now we're back in the present. There's only one sequence that's completely out of order, and that's the end of the shooting, let's say, with the guy coming out of the bathroom to the wolf, and then finally the diner sequence, which is lifted from like the first third of the movie and then placed at the end. Otherwise, everything else happens in the same linear timeline and is forward momentum.
Well, the beginning and the end are out of sequence with the rest of the film because Vega's dead in the middle of the film. So the beginning and the end predate the rest of the film.
And I think that was such a genius move because if you conclude this massive career resurgence for John Travolta by watching him get shot to death in an apartment, and then we just walk away and roll credits, that would be the takeaway for fans, but it wasn't. And I think placing that out of order and putting it in the middle of the film and then still giving him the dignity, whether his character had earned it or not, to have that conversation with Jules, to listen to Jules for the fifth time say he's out. He wants to do better for himself. And we know Vincent has no designs on doing better for himself. He's too deep in the rips of addiction and violence and everything that the life brings him. But in a way, it softens his departure from the film by putting it in the middle rather than the end.
Yes, I would very much agree. But, Dad, Vega has to die by the middle of the film. So the first part is not out of order. We see in that ending sequence how they end up in the shorts and the t-shirts, which we see them walk into Marsellus Wallace's bar with that eye. So really, yes, all you're taking is this end sequence, which is the last, 40 minutes of the movie? And if you put that just back into the beginning portion, so where they cut off and then they skip forward to he's taking Mia out. If you take that portion where it's basically divided off and capped off at the end and put it back in, then the entire story would be linear.
Okay.
I can't tell you how many times I've watched this movie trying to lay out the exact timeline. And Tom, I think you're pretty close there. But the more I've seen it, the more I realize I don't want to do that. He doesn't want us to do that. That's not the point. The point is to see this story in its entirety, not to see it sequentially. And I think when you can look back on the film the way we are doing right now, it feels a little bit more dreamlike to kind of take the whole thing in and say, well, I'm not quite sure if that happened first, but does it really matter? It all sticks with us just the same. And I think that was part of the genius of the film.
Vega's back in a suit. So at some point in time, it had to be with enough time when he's changed out of the shorts and t-shirt back into a suit.
Yeah, it's a completely different day.
How many days does this movie take place over?
I'm going to guess a week, because you're talking about the fight has to happen in between there. And then Butch has to be on the run, which is the next day. And we already know that Mia and Travolta did not see each other on the same night. Marsellus had to come back from wherever he was, because he was gone when Mia needed to be taken out. And she specifically makes mention at the fight, when she sees Travolta's character, or Vincent, that I forgot to thank you for taking me out to dinner.
It was very brief, and the camera blows past her as she says it. I love that.
Exactly. But even in that passing reference, you know that happened before. So the boxing match is after, and then we have another night where Butch sleeps it off, and he goes back the next day. So at least a couple of days have interacted between then, when the briefcase went back to Marsellus, and we know that there's been a timeline. So my guess is it's about a week.
Okay. I think I'm with you on that. I was going to say maybe 5 days, but I could be talked into a week.
I mean, because you don't have a determinate amount of time between when he takes the payment and when the actual boxing match is, and somewhere in between there, he takes Mia out, which we know Marsellus is gone for an inordinate amount of time. It could be a couple of days, it could be a couple of weeks, who knows? Anything in between there can be made up. But we know that all of the events, the ending and the beginning, take place on the same day, and the payment or the exchange happens. And then we have a 2-day sequence for most of the rest of the film, with the exception of the flashback. So somewhere in between there, you have Mia and Vincent going out. And that could be any number of days.
And isn't it great that we don't need to know? I mean, that's not really the point. I know there's people who try to timeline this thing. The whole point is it's a story in completion, but like a circle. There really isn't a beginning or an end, and that's okay.
To take the ending back again, okay? So we said what the film was about. I think it's very intentional to end on Jules' speech and them leaving the diner. Intentionally that they're going to get out of the life. Because if you put it back in sequence, what we end on is Butch driving away after killing the Gimp. And that's not really a great ending note in the way that Jules' speech is.
Totally agree.
So if you had to place a genre marker on this, what would you say it falls into?
For me, this is definitely a crime drama. I mean, it is riddled with criminals. There's a lot of very dramatic elements to the story. There's way more dialogue, I think, on a rewatch than a lot of people would consider. Some people might think back on this and they'll think of like the car accidents, Butch jumping out the window after the fight. But it's really not an action movie. There's gunshots for sure. But to me, this is a crime drama.
Any love for putting it in the comedy genre?
Oh, it's funny. I mean, that's one of the things that I did get when I was 13. This was hilarious. And we'll get into Sam Jackson in a little bit. But no, this is not a comedy. I don't think it was intended to be. But what says that life's drama or crime dramas can't be hilarious? You mentioned The Departed, right? Why is Mark Wahlberg in that movie? He's the
comedic relief.
Exactly right. And he kills it. And
yes,
so I think that's kind of a tight wire act that Tarantino walks very, very carefully, but really well.
It's the first and last time I thought Mark Wahlberg was a good actor.
I'll let you say that.
Yeah. It was not in the director's notes, but is the entire scene with Butch and the basement scene with the assault, is that an homage to Deliverance?
Yes.
Okay.
Very clearly.
I mean, that's what I got after having watched it again.
I mean, it's down to like he's playing multiple roles with Burt Reynolds coming back for them, but yes, that's quite clearly ripped from Deliverance. Which, I will say, there's an entire chapter in Tarantino's commentary on film, I think it is. I can't remember if that's the exact title, but his book about films during the 70s, there's an entire chapter on Deliverance. It's fascinating. So if we were to put a finger on where this movie has been influential, I think it's undeniable it's been influential. If for nothing else, I think that it helps basically create Harvey Weinstein as a kingmaker for the rest of the 90s and into the early 2000s. I hate to say it that way, but it kind of does. Yeah. Where else has this movie been somewhat influential?
Well, I mean, we've used the term nonlinear 1,000 times, so I'll do it one more time. People love Chris Nolan, right? Mm-hmm. I love Chris Nolan. Memento is often called the gem of all nonlinear storytelling. Well, Memento came out 6 years after this. I don't think you can shoot Memento. I don't think you can fund it, even though it had a very limited budget, without the prior success of a movie like Pulp Fiction. So if you want to talk about the influence, let's start by talking about it might have given the foot in the door to someone like Chris Nolan. All right. And we've seen where that's gone, and it's been amazing. I also think that some of the smaller unseen influences, just the way that Tarantino writes dialogue, the way that he creates animated characters in live action films, I think that has been regurgitated and recreated and copied to death. Never with the same level of success that he's had, but we've seen it again and again and again. And I've got a very short list of films that came out within 5 to 8 years of Pulp Fiction that were kind of like cheap knockoffs, like the watch you would buy in Battery Park, right? But those don't exist without him. So he kind of created this tidal wave, and the ripple effect just continued through the 90s and 2000s.
I think that to some extent, Hollywood discovered a lot of the Pulp Fiction novelists. Elmore Leonard. I mean, I don't think you have Get Shorty without this.
100%.
I think that the non-linear, I would say The Hangover is in part related to this fact that they do the reveal and then have to figure out how the reveal took place. Again, is the same situation. So I think it's had a lot of impact in that way. And I think it wasn't just Weinstein, but I think a lot of Hollywood producers were looking for that next big opportunity to attract or find the person to do a new independent film. And I think that people outside of the box like M. Night Shyamalan would not have been given opportunities but for the success of this film.
The explosion of independent film or smaller film, I think, is a direct result of this. I mean, it's not the first movie that really opens the door, but it's the one that probably kicks it down. Given its relative success, again, finishing as, I believe, the number 10 box office finisher for the entire year worldwide, and the fact that it got a lot of Oscars attention and, in many people's mind at the time, should have been the rightful winner. By chance, I mean, I mentioned Harvey Weinstein, but his influence during the 90s for Oscar campaigning starts here, kind of hits its high moment about 1998 with the Shakespeare in Love issue. Go ahead, Dad.
I like how you call that an issue.
Yeah.
I mean, I already addressed that earlier this year on a completely different podcast, but still. And his influence cannot be unseen given the amount of promotion his company did to prop up other filmmakers and particularly to make Quentin's next 7-8 films, I think it is. So that alone by itself could be the influence that we're all rightly talking about. But you talked about the nonlinear sequence. I would just say the creativity of storytelling in general. I mean, you mentioned Christopher Nolan, but Oppenheimer is told in 2 separate timelines, simultaneously jumping back and forward between them. And so because of that, I think he's able to take a lot of chances on Inception and Interstellar and other things where
Dunkirk.
Dunkirk's another one.
3 timelines simultaneously, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And I think that the dialogue, very similarly, can be seen influential to many other films that come much after it. Whether we want to talk about The Departed or many other crime dramas that come after the fact. I think that the nonlinear storytelling is directly responsible for how the structure of the pilot of Breaking Bad is done, where they do the ending at the beginning. So the influence, I think, is profound. I just don't know where to place this, though, in the legacy of how it's viewed within the industry. I think clearly people have taken this as something, oh, this is what the public likes. Let me follow this example. But we don't necessarily put this on the pedestal that we do some of the other great classics.
Yeah, so you just mentioned a couple of things that I think were very interesting. You mentioned Breaking Bad as kind of like a character study in the way that it was written. Breaking Bad borrows so much from film noir because it uses the concept of the anti-hero, right? Here's this lovable Walter White. We care a lot about him. Yes, he's doing massively criminal things, but we kind of understand why. But we got to rewind. We got to go back to The Sopranos, right? And The Sopranos kind of became the bellwether for that type of character. But that type of character exists many times over within Pulp Fiction. And as much as we would love to consider studios saying, well, what do people want to see? What they realized was, wait a minute, it doesn't cost us $50 million to make 200. We can make 200 on 8.5 if we have the right person write it, if we have the right cocktail of stars. And that's what I think became Harvey Weinstein's success. And I'm not going to say that without recognizing that this is a man who will spend eternity in a very hot place. But what he realized is we can pay less, we can get more if we trust the right artist to create it. And that was Sopranos, that was Dexter, that was every anti-hero that we saw on TV from that point forward. It was Vincent Vega. It was
I think
Jules.
The Wire directly has this as a origin point.
Absolutely.
So, do you want to give us a little more background on the film, Dad? Do you have a plot summary ready for us?
I do. Pulp Fiction unravels like a jigsaw puzzle soaked in bourbon and blood. It's a dark, gritty L.A. where bad men and worse women cross paths in a labyrinth of crime and fate. Vincent Vega, a hitman with a penchant for dance floors and bad decisions, is partnered with the philosophical Jules Winnfield, who quotes the Bible before squeezing the trigger. Their boss, Marsellus Wallace, a kingpin with a soft spot for his wife, Mia, tasks Vincent with keeping her entertained. A simple job that spirals into a night of adrenaline-filled chaos. Meanwhile, Butch Coolidge, a boxer past his prime, refuses to take a dive for Wallace, igniting a deadly game of cat and mouse. In a world where conversations drip with menace and every decision has a bullet attached, the characters' lives intersect with a bang. It's a world where the wrong move means a one-way ticket to the morgue, and redemption is as elusive as the briefcase everyone's chasing.
Thank you. Now, we had a special request, and this has only been done one other time before, when we had a guest so intertwined with a particular movie that was one of their favorites, that they requested to do the entire Did You Know section themselves. But we have such a guest. Adam, did you know?
Did you know, Tom, that Samuel L. Jackson was not Quentin Tarantino's first choice to play Jules? He had his eyes set on Lawrence Fishburne for the iconic role first. Fishburne declined after much consideration because his representation said, there is absolutely no way, Lawrence, you can play second fiddle to John Travolta. Now, in the early 80s, that might have been a great idea. But by the mid-90s, Travolta was ice cold. And Fishburne's people said, you can't play second fiddle to a guy who deserves to be playing second fiddle to you. So Fishburne passed, Sam Jackson was next in line, and the rest is history. Did you know that when Quentin Tarantino wrote the role of Vincent Vega, he was actually thinking of Michael Madsen, which is why when Travolta eventually ended up cast as the role, Mr. Blonde from Reservoir Dogs and Vincent Vega are alleged to be brothers. Did you know? Samuel L. Jackson's wig in the film was purchased by mistake. A production assistant was sent to South Central Los Angeles to a wig shop that specialized in wigs for the African American community. This PA was unfamiliar with the difference between an afro wig and a jerry curl wig. When returning back to the set, Tarantino and Jackson had a great laugh over the jerry curl wig, and after trying it on, they decided, this is Jerry Curl Jules, and they stuck with it. And did you know that unlike most iconic auteur directors, Quentin Tarantino didn't go to film school? Instead, his encyclopedic film knowledge and unique voice as a storyteller and writer comes from his years of working in a Manhattan Beach video store called Video Archives. Tom, Dana, he's just like us.
I think that's always been part of the appeal. I
love
will
it.
also say that Samuel L. Jackson also was in Die Hard with a Vengeance because he was in this movie. Because that also, at the time, was rumored to go to Lawrence Fishburne, but he did not want to play a second fiddle role.
Oops.
And with that, we will take our first break, and we will be right back. Before we jump back into the episode, next week for our 228th episode, we welcome back Kieran B. of the Best Picture cast to revisit yet another 1994 classic, The Shawshank Redemption, written and directed by Frank Darabont, music by Thomas Newman, cinematography by the great Roger Deakins, starring Tim Robbins, Morgan Freeman, Bob Gunton, and Clancy Brown. You won't want to miss that one, so watch ahead of the show by searching the Real Good app to find where it's streaming for you. That's REELGOOD. before we get too much further, Adam, remind people where you are and what you have going on.
Yeah, thanks so much for asking. I'm the managing editor at moviearcher.com, senior film critic there as well. Very excited about one branch of Movie Archer that's really been expanding. It's our streaming television portion. Traffic really picking up in that area. Rachel, who writes our film reviews, is doing a fantastic job, and the following continues to grow. So we're really proud of that. Looking forward to the Chicago International Film Festival coming up in October. It will be the festival's 60th year, which is always a big deal.
And I hear a mutual friend of ours has signed up for his critic credentials.
Allegedly, yeah. He put in the application as a podcaster, which all are invited. I'm not a part of the selection committee. I'm really hoping that he ends up a part of the show there. It's an unbelievable experience. There's great access. Now, last year, it was on the tail end of the actors' strike. And so actors weren't allowed to attend festivals unless they had a specific exemption or they had produced or directed a film. So a few slipped through, but for the most part, it was a lot of directors there representing films. But this year's going to be a big one. And I know for the 60th, they're pulling out all the stops. So yes, I hope that our friend Andrew Corns is able to join us. And if not, maybe year number 61. We'll see.
Well, I hope that's a lot of fun, and I wish everyone well. We support all film festivals here, as we have been big proponents in the spring for the Wisconsin and Beloit film festivals up here. So, before we get too much further as well, we have Ask Dana Anything. Unfortunately, we don't have any audience submissions. So I turn to our guest. Adam, is there anything you want to know about Dana?
Yeah, this actually works out really well because you already brought it up, and we just mentioned our friend Andrew over at the Revisionist Almanac, and I'm going to steal a question. So Dana, go back in time. It's March 27th, 1995. It's the 67th Academy Awards. Nominated that day for Best Picture, Forrest Gump, the eventual winner, Shawshank Redemption, which you just promoted for next week. Can't wait to listen to that. And then, of course, Pulp Fiction. Dana, did the right film win that night?
I had actually went to the movie theater and saw Shawshank Redemption. I think I was one of the 10 people who did that opening weekend. And unfortunately, we were late, so I never saw the opening scene. And in fact, every time I watched Shawshank Redemption, I picked it up in the middle of someplace. So it wasn't until we did the show and we did it that I actually saw the opening scene where the murder took place. You know, they just allude to it, and I'm like, oh, I guess they just kind of imply it. But it was a different time. Okay, and it's where you rewarded films not just for the quality of the story, but for their ability to connect with the public and to be bigger than life and to draw an audience. Okay, and if you would ask me if those three films were brought today, which one should win? I'd have a hard time picking between Shawshank and Pulp Fiction. But in 1995, I think you had to say that it was correct. It's just a very different standard of review. And so at the time, I remember I loved Forrest Gump. I loved Shawshank Redemption. I couldn't understand why no one else ever heard of it or why it didn't do well, because when I saw it in the theater, I was just amazed at how good it was. So I guess I would say yes, because things have just changed over the last 30 years.
Gump was a tidal wave. I mean, at the time, I think a lot of people have found ways to poke holes in it looking back. But at that time, I remember my parents bought the double CD soundtrack, and it's all we listened to for about 2 years. I think Shawshank was done in by its title, to be honest with you. If that movie was called Red Was Here instead of The Shawshank Redemption, people looked at that. And remember, people were looking at newspapers back then, and the type of film-based media didn't exist. And they said, well, if I can't pronounce it, if I don't know what it is, compare that to Forrest Gump, Pulp Fiction, and then you have The Shawshank Redemption, which wasn't even the same title as the Stephen King short story. So I don't know. It was turning people off before they even got a chance to come in the door.
I mean, when we talk back in 1995 or 94, I saw the films. Tom's 4. His sister was 1. His other sister wasn't even born. We lived in a remote location. We had to drive 40 minutes to even get to a movie theater. It was like 35, 40 miles away, that type of situation. But again, Forrest Gump was just such a huge film that everybody talked about. And, I was one of the few people that had ever heard of Shawshank or saw it and kept going on about how, hey, this is really a great film. And I hadn't seen Pulp Fiction until the next year. So I guess the long and short of it is, yes, I think at that time they did get it right.
Well, thank you for your question, Adam. And we appreciate all questions that are sent in for our little purposes. So let's move then to the Stanley rubric. First up, we have Legacy. And as for anyone who has followed the show before, you know that we skip the middle portion of our regular program for these revisits. We only intend to do the rubric scoring or revisit the rubric scoring. Normally, we would choose between best quotes, best scenes, and this movie has a lot of those things. But if you want to, you can listen to our original episode 12, where I had a guest on, Phil Martinez, who I grew up with, went to high school with at the time. And that's one of our very raw early episodes that you might have a treat knowing the difference between the original episodes and where we've come now, almost 5 years later, I guess. But even so, Legacy is a measurement of the 5 years after the film came out, so roughly about 1999 to today. What is the legacy of this film as split between the industry and the audience at large? Now, us as podcasters, maybe senior film critics and managing editors, I would treat us more in the industry as opposed to the audience at large. I kind of treat those as somewhat film lovers and film casual fans. Maybe not the people who never see movies at all, even though we've occasionally contributed some people anecdotally into this category as a result of that. But our original legacy score on this one was a 9.25. Dad, did we get this right or wrong? Well, excuse me. Did Phil and I get this right or wrong?
I think it's a little low.
Okay.
I had 4.5 for the industry and 5 for the public, simply because the critics really had some level of mixed feelings about it. I know it got nominated for a lot of Academy Awards and such, but the fact that the public flocked to this little low-budget film in such amounts that it made 20 times, or was it? No, it's not 20. It's 4.5 times. 4 times its budget was amazing at the time. So I think it overall it should have been a 9.5.
So you're looking for closer to 20 times its budget. This is why we
never
don't ask you to do the math around here. Yeah.
I know. Yeah, well, that's why I went into law.
We know. It's been asked and answered. I find it hard to really go below what we had before. The question is really, do we move it slightly up? I'm comfortable with the 9.25 because I do think there are some criticisms of this, and this isn't a widely appealing film, but this is something that is extremely pop culturally relevant. It's got certain lines that have been repeated in mass over and over and over again. We talked about how the industry practices changed and what it promoted, whether positive or negative. The negative being somewhat the path of Harvey Weinstein. It unfortunately his name does have to be mentioned along with this and the path of Quentin Tarantino, unfortunately, because they're pretty well tied together. But
I got to defend the film against Harvey Weinstein, though. Yes, Harvey had his hands in the distribution, yes, Harvey was the one who helped come up with the funding. He didn't write this movie. He didn't direct this movie. He didn't deliver any lines. And I bristle a little bit at the idea that we're going to start discrediting films that have his name attached to them, because to me, that is robbery of the art. And all of the people that worked so hard to make this film what it was, he was a profiteer and he would exploit his power. And we can go into his story. But we can't penalize Pulp Fiction for the fact that Harvey Weinstein produced it. I don't feel comfortable doing that. We know where he's going.
I in no way was meaning to penalize it, just acknowledge the influence that he gained because of this movie.
Yeah, because to carry your point, Adam, we don't criticize Michelangelo for the De Medicis.
Seems like an explanation for a different podcast.
Yeah. I think you're on Die Hard History or whatever it is.
Yeah. I'll have to blow the dust off of some of my history books so I understand that.
But either way, I mean, I'm comfortable around a 9.5. I'd be comfortable at a 9.25. The only issue I might take is maybe going to the full 10. And just because I don't know how many casual fans have probably picked this up, even as widely appealing as it is at times, and how many people we feel have probably seen it on an anecdotal level, it's hard to measure exactly how many people, even now, 30 years later, have actually seen the film.
Can I share an anecdote about this film?
Sure.
This summer, my wife and I were very lucky to go to Europe for a little while. And we spent time in 3 major cities, Lisbon, Barcelona, and then eventually in Paris, where we were able to take in the Olympics. In all 3 of those cities, I saw people walking down the street wearing written and directed by Quentin Tarantino shirts, Pulp Fiction merchandise, and I saw a guy in Lisbon in a Jules wig. And this is 30 years after this movie released. And this is a distinctly Los Angeles film, right? I think the impact of this film is global. I think, if anything, it's picking up steam as we're getting newer generations of people that are being introduced to it. I don't think it's going anywhere. So I would argue that its legacy is stronger now than it was in 94, in 99, and in 04. And I would argue that it's entering into the pantheon of the greatest films of all time in terms of its legacy and its impact. Now, that's the public. But if you want to talk about the way that the industry views this film, what's the greatest form of flattery?
Imitation.
That's exactly right. We already mentioned Get Shorty, Very Bad Things, 2 Days in the Valley, Go. Those were films that were released within 5 years. These were major budget, big star films. But they can't exist without Tarantino's success. So in terms of the way that the industry viewed this, they couldn't get enough. This is an industry 5 for me. This is a public 5 for me. I think 9.25 is too low.
I'm going to have a really hard time poking holes in that. I mean, I know that I've tried to come down off of it, but we kind of talked up the industry side of it, talked up the public side of it, which I actually think there's a stronger appeal that the audience may be a bigger driver of this film than it is the industry. I think the industry has reluctantly accepted its place, even though I don't think that's part of the reason. I mean, there's a story that supposedly Steven Spielberg took Quentin Tarantino out on like the golf course before the Oscars and said, "Hey, buddy, you're not winning the Oscar for Best Picture here. So just relax, have fun." Like, they knew that ahead of time and basically told him, you know, it's not your time yet, which the Oscars has a history of doing whether we like it or not.
It makes me sad to think that maybe his time won't come for that award if he only has one more in him.
I really hope that now that he pulled back from whatever he was working on, that whatever he's got left, he puts whatever mustard he has remaining in the tube all into this film, because I am on pins and needles waiting for that one. And when it was rumored that Tommy Cruise was potentially going to be the lead of that film, My like spider senses went tingling. But anyway, that is no longer the case. We live in a different world. We'll deal with what we get when we get it. I just have a feeling that every major actor that he's worked with before in his entire career will show up for that film in some capacity or another, even if it's for 10 seconds.
I think Quentin Tarantino has become a bucket list for some of the best artists of all time. I think knowing that he only has one left, I think there will be a line of actors kicking down the door to try to get any part they can in that film, just to have that within their own filmographies. So I think he's going to have his choice of whomever and whatever he wants.
All right, Dad, what do you think? Do we come up to his 10, or do we have some credible argument to knock it off of the pedestal?
I'm having a hard time disagreeing with him. It brought Travolta back for a decade or more until his acting fell off. But
Battlefield Earth.
I mean, his acting was never great. Even in this movie, it's kind of hamish. When he's not dancing, I mean, he's kind of...
I don't know. I was expecting Mr. Cotter to show up at times, but okay.
When he's waving a gun, I just figured it was a gun hand jive.
Yeah. Anyway. Okay, I mean, I can live with it.
Yeah, I think we've backed ourselves into a corner. I'm having the same difficulties, so we settle on a 10.
That's what I'm talking about. I love it.
I mean, nobody can tell us that we are not reasonable people on this show, and we can be persuaded.
You have just proven such.
All right, let's go to impact and significance. This is the measurement of the 5 years that we just discounted. So this would be roughly 1994 to 1999. And this is also a split category between industry and the audience at large, how its impact was felt across both spheres. In this, we originally gave it an 8.5. I think we were a little bit low. I personally have this at probably a 4 on the audience side because I think it's picked up a little bit more over time. That Adam, you made that argument a little bit earlier. I think that it was inaccessible for some people at the time, and the uniqueness of its kind of storytelling device and its violence and some other things kind of made it so that even though it was 10th worldwide at the time, it still was not necessarily seen by all film fans in an era where going to the theater was a much, much bigger deal. However, we already kind of talked up how the industry felt about this one, how it imitated, how its effect had on the movie culture at large at the time. I think it's hard to overstate that. Sam Jackson becomes a bigger star, that Travolta has a resurgence, that Quentin Tarantino becomes one of the most famous directors known to man at that point in time. I have a 5 on the industry. I have a 4 on the public. I have a 9.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna sound a lot like you here, but I think you just mentioned a lot of the things that I was gonna say. But I think when we look at the whole thing and we put it together, I think I was more of like a 4.5 and a 4.5. But my math is still good. That's still a 9. So I'm gonna roll with you on that and defer to you there.
Having lived through this time frame, this was a film that when it came out on, at that time, VHS, a year and a half later, it was big on HBO. It was big in the video stores. And so even though you have what was a pretty good number going to the theater to see it, this became even larger within that 2-year window of people seeing it. It was almost, I would say that 85 to 90% of the public either saw it in full or at least part of it. This became huge in the secondary market. And I have a hard time giving it within that initial impact less than a 5 for the public. Because even though they didn't go and flock to the theaters, people were intrigued by it because it was one of these rumor mills. Oh, you've got to see this film. You've got to see this film. Not necessarily that everybody who saw it liked it, obviously, as I've discussed, but it was one that everybody talked about. So I think it's low to go with even a 9. I gave it 5 and 5. The fact that
Let's
a
go.
first-time director gets that level of...
Second-time
director gets that level of Academy Award nominations.
Giselle won for his second film.
But at the time, it was unique.
Fair.
So I'm at a 10. 5 and 5.
And I, of course, have no problem with that. Hey, we can't let this pod roll through without mentioning Dick Dale's Miserlou, right? The opening credits song. When that thing hit, and I know you were doing the dance in our open here, Dana. When that song hit, it was like, wait a minute, what am I watching? Is this surf rock? And then it transitions into Jungle Boogie, which takes us right into the car with Vincent and Jules. The impact on that, just the soundtrack sales of this movie, I had never seen or heard anything treat music the way that this film did.
So even though you gave me your 9, you're already just deferring. So it's basically 2 10s versus my 9, and I have to come up with some way to argue against somebody, well, basically 2 people who went through this period of time in a way that I did not, and argue against you on the public, and then somehow come up with and argue against everything I've said up to this point on the pod for a 5 for the industry, which is what I gave it already. So I think I've backed myself into a corner again.
Say what again?
God damn it.
Yeah, your extended film watching was Rio
Peter Pan.
Bravo.
Oh, well,
Peter
okay.
Pan, but you watched Rio Bravo by this time.
You were knee deep in Lion King.
That was my adult film.
Yes, Stumpy was an old guy like Grandpa.
Yes, he was. All right, I'll reluctantly cede to the 10.
Aha.
Through 2 categories, we have 2 10s. Novelty, which is a measurement of both the originality of the idea and the originality of its execution, as well as the just execution overall. We split this category between the originality and the execution scores, 5 and 5. Before we did that, we gave this originally an 8 on the first episode back some 4-odd years ago, 4.5 years ago. Dad, did we get this right or wrong?
I've been all over the board with this. I'm going to say we got it a tad wrong. Tarantino would take great advice and to not emulate Hitchcock. When he acts in his own films, it is clear that he should not. Overall, the execution was pretty good. In fact, pretty stellar. The biggest problem I have is that it's basically still a film noir. And if you just do it linearly, I don't think it's that novel from a lot of films of the time frame over the previous 30 years. The novelty is in the nonlinear format and the homages to other films that if you're not a film fanatic, you're not going to pick up on. So I'm going to go with an 8.5 for novelty overall, with the down points primarily for Tarantino's acting and just a few plot holes. I mean, I understand they have to shoot the guy's head off or shoot him in the face, but it doesn't really explain how. I mean, Vega is supposedly a hitman. He should know enough of how to hold a gun without it going off in the guy's face.
There's a lot of questions about Vincent, though. I mean, is he really that good at his job?
Well, no, because what hitman leaves his gun on the counter while he's in the shitter?
What hitman constantly needs to be on a brand diet so that he firms some shit up?
Ones that are unfortunately addicted to narcotics.
I guess.
Yeah.
But either way, what is your final score?
8.5.
All right. I have a 5 on the novelty. I think it would be inescapable to say that this is one of the more original ideas when it came out, despite the fact that it's borrowing from all these places and it's kind of a hodgepodge of all the things that he liked. I think that's what made the film somewhat endearing to critics at the time, is this guy took all of the stuff and just made a movie that was specifically for him. And he's always said, if you don't like my movies, go watch something else. So he's not afraid to do things that are just in his terms, and he makes movies that he would like to see. That was somewhat refreshing at the time where you had mostly studio films. It was before the real independent film boom that was about on the edge of what was to occur. And this movie in some way is responsible for a good section of that. But on the execution side of it, there are several actors in this that are not particularly good. I could give or take Amanda Plummer at times. I could take Butch's girlfriend, Fabienne. She is not particularly good in this movie. And Quentin himself is not a good actor. If he will take a cue from Hitchcock, if he's going to be in his own movies, he should be seen and not heard. He was fine in Reservoir Dogs when he starts off the film, but by the time we get to this film, and he will come up again when it comes to classicness, it was not a good moment for him. I don't care how good his coffee is.
His coffee might have been great, but yeah, there are some choices in there that I think maybe he, in an honest moment, would admit that he wanted back.
And to grade this on a scale of his own work, partly due to the fact that the budget, you can see some effects in the fact that it's somewhat cheaply made. It doesn't look that way. It looks closer to a $40 or $50 million budget, but there are some choices comparative to what he's done now, where he can recreate the Sunset Strip in a way that he couldn't for this film, just because he's given a lot more latitude by studios since then. So I would give it probably about a 5 from the originality and a 4 for the execution, just personally.
Okay, I'm very close to where you are there, Tom. Literally the most original movie I had ever seen when I saw this in the theater. And admittedly, I hadn't seen everything when I was 13 years old. But even looking back at it now in my 40s, this is still one of the most original films that's ever been made. No one has come close to doing anything this unique. So that's a clear 5 for me. Now, you guys have brought up a couple of really interesting points on the execution side of things. I don't think we can discount just how much faith he had to have in himself to tell this story in this way. And you have to believe that there were people trying to talk him out of this because it wasn't straightforward. It was going to turn some people off. He took radical chances, and 9 out of 10 of those chances paid off. And maybe the one that didn't was putting himself in the movie. So in terms of execution, I'm going to go 4.75. So overall, I'm a 9.75.
All right. Both of you are the high and low men on this one. So you will have to work it out amongst yourselves. I am perfectly comfortable being the median point between them.
So Dana, you were 8.5?
Yes.
Yes.
Meet you at 9.25?
I like the 9.
And where were you on this, Tom?
I was at a 9.
Feels like a 9.
All right. Either way, we still moved up from the original score.
As we should.
So to recap to this point, we have moved from a 9.25 to a 10 on Legacy, an 8.5 to a 10 on Impact and Significance, and an 8 to a 9 on Novelty. So that looks like a good spot for our second break. We'll be right back. Before we jump back into the episode, as of this last month, all of our episodes are also now in video format. That's right, you can see my resting nerd face and all of Dana's famous OKs in pristine high definition. So far, we have 12 different episodes now available to watch. Just head to youtube.com/@gmodepodcast, or I have the full video and audio feeds on our website, ronnieduncanstudios.com/gmodepodcast. Both of those are in the episode description of this episode, so check us out there. And if you do, please like the video or subscribe to us. We would really appreciate it. Dad, do we have anyone to remember this week?
Yes. Betty Bridges, 83, American actress. Good Times, Ally McBeal. Different Strokes, ER, Hill Street Blues. Also served as an acting coach. O.B. Defo, 51, American actor. Dawson's Creek, and Stargate SG-1.
And so we remember these here fondly for their contributions with a moment of silence in their honor. Thank you. All right, let's move to our final couple of categories. We left off at classicness. Originally, this was scored out as a 9.25, and this is the most amorphous category that we have in our repertoire. This can mean a great host of different things, but really it just means, has this movie aged well or not? Was it ahead of its time or not? Is it timeless or not? So those are really the three qualifiers that we kind of have for most of this. So, Dad, with a 9.25, did we get this right or wrong?
Wrong. Classicness has to go down from there. And where I'm coming in with this is the drug and heroin, specifically heroin and cocaine use, cannot have such a prominent position in a film, given our most recent opioid crisis that we had, and the fact that so many people have lost loved ones to overdoses. To make the overdose almost comical in trying to bring her around, and the hypodermic needle in her chest and all of that, I think would be offensive to a lot of people who have been through this crisis, either personally by loss of loved ones or somebody who's recovered from an opioid addiction. And so I had a problem with that in rewatching it. But still, the rest of the film, overall, I still had an 8.5.
Well, that's interesting, because that's the exact score that I also had, but I didn't factor in the heroin usage, but maybe I should have. Usually when we start at a 7 and work our way up or down, we're talking about either we're giving points away for something being ill classic, something that has not aged well, and you talked about the heroin usage. I'll talk about Quentin Tarantino feeling very comfortable in using the N-word like 12 times in one monologue. I don't care if you grew up in LA around a lot of black people, it still does not age well. Yeah. So, regardless of that, I would say that maybe carries it a half step down, but I give this also a point up for a little bit of timelessness. I mean, it's 30 years on. It's got a little bit of still juice that's remaining for it, that people still want to see it, that it feels still somewhat relevant. So I ended up at an 8.5, but if I were to factor in yours, which I think is actually a fairly good point, I would probably carry it down to an 8, but for the sake of this argument, I'll just leave it at the 8.5.
The extreme close-up of the syringe when Vincent Vega is shooting up, and the blood from his arm trickles in, and then it's all plunged into his system. That was the most impactful image from the movie when I saw it, admittedly too young, and it scared me to death. I said, oh my God, why would people do that to themselves? And it opened up this whole understanding and pursuit of understanding with regard to addiction, with regard to dangerous behaviors. And I didn't, for any moment of the film, take what happened to Mia and the adrenaline injection that had to be put into her heart. I never, at that age, took that as comedy. And rewatching it as many times as I have, I do think that some of the ancillary characters within that scene are on edge, high strung, and that could be read as comedy. But to me, that's a horror film. That is as frightening as things can be. And to me, that's the dividing line between us knowing Vincent Vega is going to make it versus he's not. Because even having gone through that and having to save the life of this girl by literally stabbing her in the heart, he still wouldn't put down the needle. And we know that he wouldn't change his ways. And he was so deep into his addiction. So I've never read that as comedy. I've always read that as a cautionary tale. So Dana, I respect the heck out of what you said there about the opioid epidemic, but I never interpreted it in that way. To me, it was, look what will happen. Look at the horrible path that you'll be led down. Now, Tom, what you mentioned about Tarantino's character Jimmy and his language, it sounded worse, and it sounded like sandpaper every single time it came out of his mouth. To this day, I can't understand it. And I know QT has said, hey, if you don't like my movies, you don't like that language. I can't get over it. To me, that's tough. And I think we're giving Tim Roth's character Pumpkin a pass too, because in the very opening scene, I mean, he went on major groups, and none of that has aged well. None of that has aged well. That being said, this is an unmistakable classic film with some flaws that you can't miss. And so for that reason, I have it down at a 9.
I guess it's not quite as glaring for me to think about somebody that's in Tim Roth's position just throwing out those type of epitaphs. Whereas I think we're led to believe that Jimmy is some type of studio executive, and that's why it feels so odd coming from a guy who's just drinking coffee in his own bathrobe. I don't know. It doesn't fit the rest of the scene, because equally, when Walken's on screen and he's yelling the G word, that feels fitting because that was a service term often used by members of the military, particularly if you had to be in a Vietnamese prisoner of war camp. Like, that didn't feel off-putting. But for whatever reason, that moment in the film feels a little out of place.
It's like you could hear a record scratch every time he used the word, and that was tough.
And if it's one usage, or maybe even 2, it'd be one thing, but it's like 7, 8, 9, 10. Just bang, 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 bang. Over and over and over again. So I don't know, for whatever reason, that moment sticks out a little bit more than the others. So there's not much difference between the three of us. All of us have this coming down just slightly. I guess we could either settle at the 8.75, or we figure out which one of us we go up or down to. We have 2 8.5s and a 9.
It's so hard for me to defend, any of the points that we just brought up in a movie that I very openly love and care about, and I feel like really influenced my love of film. But they are clear warts, so I defer to you guys on this.
All right, that seems fair, especially since you brought us up on several of the other categories. So I think it evens out in the end. So let's go with the 8.5 and just settle it there. All right. Finally, rewatchability. I have a feeling that I may be the low man now on this particular category, in a way that I didn't think I would be a few days ago. But this is not a movie that I'm like doing maybe once a year. It's not a sick movie for me. I don't have quite that level of affinity. I watch it every few years or so when I get that particular itch. Somebody quotes it or it comes up in pop culture and you're like, I haven't seen that in a while, so I suppose go back and revisit it type of thing. And if it were on somewhere I was channel surfing or, any number of things, if it comes up, I'd probably sit and watch a few select scenes here or there. But to me, on my own personal rubric for this category, that puts it at about a 3 and a 3. So I have a 6.
Hold on, I got to catch my breath after you just gave Pulp Fiction a 6 for rewatchability. Well, let's play the law of averages. I am someone who will pop this movie on just to revisit the absolute greatness of Samuel L. Jackson in this film. And I know we weren't stopping to talk about individual performances, but tour de force. Probably the greatest command of Tarantino's dialogue of any character in any one of his films I've ever seen. Just incredible the way that he could deliver, the way that he could have a softness about him, these aspirations of leaving a horrible life, and everything he said was perfect. So for me to just put this on, even for that alone, that's a 5. And the crazy thing about the nonlinear fashion in which this story is told is that makes it utterly rewatchable, because you could pick it up 10 minutes in or 10 minutes from the end, and you can't say, oh, well, Vincent's already dead, we're now on a downslope, or wow, wasn't that exciting to see what was happening in Goodfellas, but now that everybody's addicted, now it's kind of a Debbie Downer. No, this movie never stops to admire itself at any point. So you can turn this on at any point and it's still perfect. It's a 5. So this is a rewatchability 5 to just put it on and watch it all the way through. Or if it's on TV, like you said, doesn't matter when you pick it up. You can't wait to see that next scene because you know it's coming. This is a 10.
I never had an opportunity to weigh in on the rewatchability to begin with.
That is true.
In watching this film, it is something that I should watch again within the next year to 2, simply because...
Every week with you.
Huh?
Every week. This is a movie I should watch more often. So watch more movies.
Well, I still have a job.
Don't mind if I do.
But still, this should, I'm going to put this kind of on that edge. I actually came in at a 7.5 for rewatchability. It shouldn't take me, every 5 to 7 years to rewatch this film.
All right, so I normally save us the trouble of trying to argue rewatchability since it's not technically an objective category, and I just average this one, so that would be a 7.83. Now,
I accept that as math, but I do not accept that as fact.
Fine.
Subjectivity.
But either way, it moves slightly down in that category. Now,
what have we done?
Also for audience score, originally we had the Rotten Tomatoes score as the only score when we were still doing that early on, and that was only a 96%. It has not changed. It is still a 96% among audience members on Rotten Tomatoes. However, the Google score was only a 92%. So that moves it to a 9.4. So also slightly down. So to repeat the categories yet again, Legacy, we moved from a 9.25 to a 10. For Impact and Significance, we had an 8.5 originally, we moved to a 10. For the original Novelty score, we had an 8, we moved to a 9. For Classicness, we moved from a 9.25 to 8.5. For Rewatchability, we moved from an 8.25 to a 7.83. And for Audience Score, we moved from a 9.6 to a 9.4. The original total score on this episode was a 52.85. It is currently number 15 on our list. Do we have any guesses as to where this currently would end up?
Put it in the top 10.
Going to be about 12th.
We have a 54.73. So it moves up a couple of points, and that would place it at number 7, between Casablanca and The Godfather.
Oh.
And if we want to
Good
talk about
company.
movie history, I feel like that is apt company for this film. Gentlemen, a job well done.
If you disagree with any of our scoring, you can, of course, write us at greatestalltimemoviepodcast@gmail.com. You can find us on any of our socials at GMOTPodcast on X, Letterboxd, YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter. Or you can find us on our website, RonnieDuncanStudios.com/GMOTPodcast. Let's move to remaining questions, of which there are many for this film. It is ripe for remaining questions. Number 1. What's in the briefcase? The debate that has festered for many, many, many years.
It glows. So I guess Patches O'Houlihan's urine.
Oh, man, my answer is way less exciting than that, Dana. Tom, I don't even know if you want to respond to that.
Is there a response? I mean, no, it's kind of out there, but there is the novelization point where it's a metaphorical. It's supposedly Marsellus Wallace's soul that he sold to the devil, and thus why there's a Band-Aid on the back of his neck. That's supposedly the true answer. There's a lot of other people that think it's just kind of a tangible effect, and therefore it's heroin. So when he says, "Is that what I think it is?" that it has a much more tangible effect to somebody who's out on the street robbing liquor stores and restaurants would know exactly what's in the briefcase as opposed to someone's soul, which I don't know if you would recognize at first glance. Like, what does a soul look like?
I don't know, maybe it glows.
For some people it might, and for others it may not. Guys, I'm going to go with a hot take here. There's nothing in that suitcase. That suitcase is one of the greatest MacGuffins in film history. It certainly drives the plot. Doesn't matter what's in it. And all of the debate and the souls and the what other theories there might be, it truly doesn't matter. So I'm going to go with the very boring but answer that is true to me. There's nothing in that suitcase.
I'm going to go with it's the long-lost version of Orson Welles' cut of The Magnificent Ambersons. To tie it to an episode that was just released on last Friday, that'd be the 1942 episode of the Revisionist Almanac. Catch it on all your major podcast platforms, of which myself and my co-host were both guests on that podcast. Why does Vincent not check the bathroom?
Because he's a dipshit?
He's bad at his job.
Yeah, he's terrible at his job. Literally, for a guy who needs to shit all the time, how do you not check the bathroom?
Yeah.
But he's kind of a lovable loser. I mean, like he went to Paris, right?
Amsterdam.
Oh, excuse me. He went to Amsterdam.
You went to Paris.
Some of us did, yeah. He had the Royale with cheese, the affinity he has for European culture. Like, there's a lot to love about Vincent. You know, he took one for the team and he took Mia dancing. But when it comes down to being a hitman, he's a drug-addicted loser. He's bad at his job.
Also, we don't know why he was over there in the first place or why he's now come back. It's just completely open-ended.
By the way, with an aside, while you were in Paris, did you go into a McDonald's and have the Macron?
No, that's a really good question. My wife and I made the pact with one another that in going to Europe, we would not eat in any places that were readily available in the States. So no, McDonald's was not a part of our diet while we were there.
Oh, I not only went into McDonald's, our French exchange student or Russian exchange student living in France at the time took us there so that we could have the little Macrons. But it overlooked the Champs-Élysées and
we walked right by it.
Arc de Triomphe.
Mm-hmm.
Or Arc de Triomphe, or the
Triomphe,
Arc de Triomphe.
Careful with your language there. It's not the Arc de Triomphe yet.
It's the Arc de...
as much as he'd like to cover that in gold and with his own signature.
The Arc de
Triomphe.
And so we could look out the window of this place, have those little mini, whatever you call them, that were, you know, different flavors, eat
Macaroons?
those and look out at this. So I'm thinking, this is just weird.
I mean, it is the goal of every fascist to walk into Paris through the Arc de Triomphe, but, you know, he hasn't gotten there yet.
You know why the Champs-Élysées is lined with trees, right? So the Germans can walk in the shade.
Okay. Were Mia and Vincent going to hook up? If she doesn't OD.
No, absolutely not. They were not going to hook up. He feared his boss so much. And the whole conversation about the person who was thrown out of the window for giving an alleged foot rub. No. He was bad at his job. And he was stupid, but I don't think he was that stupid.
Good point.
I think they would have hooked up. All it would have taken is her to basically, you know, you are supposed to stay here and entertain me. If I say that you misentertain me.
My husband, your boss, Marsellus Wallace.
And I think she was much more rip-redding to go than he was. But she OD'd, so we don't know. Would you keep as your most prized possession something that had been up the ass of two other guys for at least 7 years? And how much would you have to clean it first?
Shout out to Captain Coons, by the way. His dedication to that watch and to a young Butch is just commendable. I think that today we have so many professional grade cleaning solvents that if it had come from my great-grandfather who had barely survived a war, I would consider getting the right product and then keeping that in my home. I might be on my own on this one, but I'm going to say
on your
I think we could get the job done.
Boy, I don't know. I mean, Also, hiding that up an ass. You look at the watch, it has like 4 really distinct prongs in there. Like, that would have been really painful.
Yep. But it meant a lot to them. So they did what they had to do. I mean, Dana, is there anything that you're planning on leaving behind for Tom that we should know about?
I don't want any of it.
A gavel?
Anything that came from an anal cavity search.
I had any kidney stones, so that's out.
Yeah, but that's coming out the wrong end. Where did the gimp come from?
Dana, you got this one.
I'm like, I have no clue. I mean, really. I mean, I'm at a loss. Let's just put it that way.
That might have only been the 4th worst thing that I saw at 13, by the way. And I had a lot of questions. But no, I have no idea where the gimp came from. I'm guessing he was some sort of drug addict that was kidnapped and placed into that bondage. I never really wanted to know, to be honest with you.
The final question here. Which weapon would you have picked to save Marsellus?
The chainsaw would have been rather noisy.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. That would have been a mistake.
Yeah.
It's also slow.
The hammer would have been good. But I think if you look at QT's whole filmography, using the samurai sword and then knowing what we know about the Kill Bill saga, it's just perfect. It's perfect. It ties it all together.
I don't know, a claw hammer, if it would have been ideal. And not the hammer, but the claw.
There's a part of me that wonders why he couldn't have found a gun in a pawn shop. I mean, I know that the shotgun is in the room with them, so because that was my original thought is can't you find the pump action shotgun? But we know where that ends up. But it's a pawn shop. There's gotta be a lot of guns.
Yeah, the question is ammo.
Or if they were locked, I suppose. But
and the question also then is how much did Butch know about ammo? You know, if he pulls a gun and does he know which type of ammo to grab, even if they have ammo to put in the gun?
I also think that if he had gone to a gun, and let's assume there was one available, it's way less personal than a sword. And when you looked at the nature of the crime that was being committed, it was about as deep a violation, no pun intended, of one's person as you could probably imagine. And so to use the sword to really separate the victim from the issue, I really thought that was probably the most effective way to settle that situation.
If you were going to really do an homage to Deliverance, a crossbow would have been really good.
And silent, good point. Really good point.
Any remaining questions for either of you?
I have one. Okay, having watched this film and watched several Tarantino films, what would it be like to go out and have a beer with this guy?
I'm sure you can find out on just about any podcast he's on.
Because, I mean, he has got to have some of the most warped ideas running through his head of a human being alive on Earth at times.
I think he's one of those guys that if you sat down next to him, you would probably get in one question. And then the remainder of your evening would be the stories that would breed from the stories and from the stories. And you might get oh, really? And from the rest of the time, he'd just be talking. And I'd be happy to listen.
I can certainly disagree. Well, I want to thank our guest, Adam. This is your second time on the show. 3 more for your hat. But remind everybody again where you are and what are you doing.
Before I do that, guys, thanks so much for having me on again. I love the show. I'd be listening to it whether you had me on as a guest or not. So I really appreciate the hard work that you guys put into making this happen. It's a really fun opportunity to get to be a part of something that I would be listening to anyway. The website is moviearcher.com. We've got streaming TV. We've got film. We've got festival coverage and more upcoming. At Movie Archer on all of the social media platforms is a great place to find me.
And we will have his personal notes and links all in the episode descriptions as well as on the website if you want to find anything there. Dad, do you have any remaining thoughts for the week?
I'm just coming back from my personal vacation. I spent the entire week reading and spending just quiet time and such, but I did get to see several old Cary Grant films that I had recorded off of TMC on DirecTV streaming, which has an unlimited DVR in the cloud, which has just been my dream because I think I've reached 350 films that I have recorded off of TMC,
TCM,
HBO, Cinemax, Sundance Channel, etc. And but they had a Cary Grant day, and I watched a lot of old Cary Grant films that I had never seen before. And I think I mentioned this a couple weeks ago. Got to see actually Kramer versus Kramer, which I had not seen since I saw it in the movie theater back in like 1978 or 79. And it is such a good film and so poignant at the time. If you have not seen it, I would encourage you to find it and watch it again. It changed, and as I said to your mother after we finished it, as an attorney, it changed so much as far as men and how men were perceived as caregivers and parents in custody and placement times. It to me was a testament to the power of film could have in changing public opinion and changing culture for the positive.
Dana, that was a movie that I saw about a year after my son was born, our oldest. And I had never seen it. I bawled my eyes out. And it, as you just said, it helped define my perception of my role as a father going forward. And so I think I'm really glad you brought that film up. What an amazing film that I think everybody needs to see.
Agreed. I think it's an underrated Best Picture winner. I also have the following year's winner as a severely underrated Best Picture winner in Ordinary People. Two family dramas I just think are exceptional films. As for mine, I will apologize if you've noticed any quality dip over the last few weeks as I've, as many people probably know by this point in the audience, started law school, a process that my father has readily described for the last 30 years as having a 3-year root canal surgery through your anus. Now, to this point, it has not been quite that painful, but there are some time sucks when it comes to law school that I cannot devote as much time and space to this particular program. And as such, if you notice a quality dip, you can certainly let us know. Let me know how I am letting you down personally and everything else. But this is more of a plea on the audience to be a little patient as we go through this new process for the next few years as I try and figure out the balance between working full-time, doing a podcast every week for all of you, possibly 2+ hours of content at this point, and going to school at least part-time, which they recommend that you spend 20 to 30 extra hours a week just doing schoolwork. Well, let's say I've figured out a little bit of balancing already, and I'm sure that my father will have some additional tips on that, but as we worm our way through these muddy waters, we'll try and figure out the best way possible. We are going to be bringing to you what we can in as best a way as we can, but I just would hope a little bit of understanding and patience, if you will. If you certainly have a quality issue, please write us. You have all of our contact information. I've said it many times on just about every episode for the last 3 years at minimum. So we are readily available to take your concerns and your questions. If you are to have listener questions or any Ask Dana Anythings, please write us at any of our available places, our email, our website, our socials. We will take all of them going forward. I know that Shawshank Redemption is a lot of people's favorite movie, and we're happy to take any questions for that next week. But with that, thank you very much for listening. We'll see you next week. Get busy living or get busy dying. Next week, for our 228th episode, we welcome back Kieran B. of the Best Picture Cast to revisit yet another 1994 classic, The Shawshank Redemption, written and directed by Frank Darabont, music by Thomas Newman, cinematography by the great Roger Deakins, starring Tim Robbins, Morgan Freeman, Bob Gunton, and Clancy Brown. You won't want to miss that one, so watch ahead of the show by searching the Real Good app to find where it's streaming for you. That's REELGOOD. Please like, follow, rate, and review, or whatever on whichever platform you have so that more can join in on our fun. You can also email the show at thenewRyanandDuncanStudios.com or at greatestalltimemoviepodcast@gmail.com. Or find us on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, Letterboxd, or TikTok at the handle @GModePodcast. The Greatest Movie of All Time is a production of Ryan Duncan Studios. Our show is mixed, edited, and written by Thomas Duncan. Our music is thanks to Purple Planet Music. Our technical provider and distributor is Captivate FM.